The aroma of roasted turkey filled the kitchen, a scent that carried decades of memory. Golden skin glistening, the bird rested on the platter my late wife had bought 30 years ago, back when Thanksgiving meant laughter, shared stories, and warmth. Now, it was a monument to tension, a reminder that family doesn't always bring comfort. I carried the turkey to the dining room, adjusting my grip on the platter, feeling the weight of it like a test. The chandelier above reflected light off the polished hardwood floor. The table was set perfectly, everything in its place. The silverware aligned, the napkins folded just so, the crystal glasses catching the light. Every detail mattered. 30 years of practice had taught me that appearances sometimes carried more weight than words. And then I saw him, Dway, my daughter's husband, sprawled at the head of the table like he owned it. Wineglass in hand, smirk plastered across his face, watching me like a hawk observing prey. "Beautiful house, Ellis," he said, his voice smooth but sharp, cutting into the turkey with a deliberate force. The knife scraped against bone, a grating sound that made me flinch slightly. "Shame it's so empty most of the time. All these bedrooms, just you rattling around." I swallowed my anger, forcing a neutral smile. My seat, the one I'd occupied for 3 decades, was taken. I was no longer head of my table. I had become a guest in my own home. Lula sat across from me, staring at her plate like it held answers she'd been searching for all her life. She hadn't hugged me when she arrived, hadn't said more than a mumbled greeting. Her silence was deliberate, a shield between us. "I'm comfortable here," I said evenly, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. "Built a life in these walls." Randall Dway, the patriarch, cleared his throat. "We've been looking at apartments, Ellis. 1-bedrooms mostly. Market's tight right now." His timing, his casual tone, it was too perfect, too rehearsed. Beverly, his wife, touched his arm with that practiced sympathy people use when they know exactly how to manipulate someone. Flames leaning forward, elbows I leaned forward, elbows on the table. "My parents are looking at tiny apartments while you've got 4 bedrooms collecting dust. Doesn't seem right." There it was, the real reason for this gathering, the underlying current I had sensed for months. Comments about property values, about my age, about how I didn't need so much space. It all added up. But suspicion and experience are different things. Experience hits you like a punch. "Your parents' housing situation isn't something I'm prepared to discuss tonight," I said, keeping my tone calm, measured. "Not prepared? We're family." His jaw tightened, a visible display of frustration. "Doesn't that mean anything to you anymore?" He paused, glancing at Lula. Shifter gaze, eyes cold, calculating. "Dway has a point, Dad. We should at least talk about it." Crimson, head heard harder than any insult, slicing through the air between us. Not because they were unexpected, the content wasn't surprising, but because of the tone. Cold, distant, almost rehearsed. This was my daughter, the girl I had raised alone after her mother died, the one I had sacrificed so much for. She was siding with him. I excused myself to the kitchen, needing a moment to steady my breath, to stop the heat from rising in my chest. Leaning against the granite countertop, I pressed my hands to the cool surface, counted to 10. In 30 years as a prosecutor, I had learned to read rooms, to read people, to anticipate actions and reactions. This wasn't a family dinner. This was an ambush. Returning to the table, I found Dway had already moved on to his second helping. His conversation was laced with commentary about family responsibility, about selfishness, about hoarding while loved ones struggle. "Family takes care of family," he said, raising his glass as if to punctuate his point. "How's work, Lula?" I tried, my voice a tether to normalcy, hoping to redirect the conversation. Dway cut her off. "We're discussing something important here, Ellis. Family takes care of family. My parents took care of me. You should understand independence and responsibility." Beverly dabbed her eyes with a napkin, playing the part of concerned mother-in-law flawlessly. Dway's performance was convincing, almost painfully so. The next hour crawled. Each comment, each smile, each feigned sigh was a calculated move. Dway's voice grew louder with each glass of wine, each jab at my lifestyle. And then came the accusation I had known was coming. You're living in denial. One person doesn't need this much space. It's wasteful, selfish. I stayed seated, hands folded, meeting his eyes without flinching. And what exactly are you suggesting? Be reasonable. Move to a manageable apartment. Let my parents stay here temporarily, just until they settle in. Texting. Temporarily? The word carried as much truth as his smile. I looked at him steadily. This is my house. I worked 30 years for it. The answer is no. Stiffness, Dway's patience evaporated. His hands shot out, grabbing the edge of his dinner plate. I saw it coming. Slow motion. Deliberate. The plate flew across the table, a blur of ceramic and rage, hitting me on the right temple with a sharp crack. Pain exploded through my skull, lightning fast. The room froze. For 3 seconds, the world held its breath. Israel touched the spot carefully. No blood, just swelling, heat radiating in waves. The pain was precise, clinical, documentable. Beverly gasped. Randall half rose, then sat back down. Dway's face shifted from rage to shock to something unidentifiable. Fear, maybe. Lula, silent until now, finally spoke. Flat, cold. Dad, you should leave. We need to discuss this. Without you. Just go. Confiscated, the room was silent, the chandelier catching the shards of plate on the hardwood floor. The family I had trusted had shown their true faces. I smiled faintly. This was only the beginning. Justice, long planned, was already in motion. Enforced, I pulled out my phone. The lawyer, the plan. 5 minutes later, the police arrived. The ambush had failed before it even fully began. The police report had barely finished being filed when I returned to my dining room. The shattered plate lay on the floor, fragments scattered like the illusions of family I had once held. Dway's parents hovered in the background, their faces carefully neutral, practicing their shock with professional precision. Beverly dabbed at her eyes again, a paper napkin trembling in her hands, while Randall whispered under his breath, no doubt coaching the perfect lines for his son. I didn't flinch. Not now, not ever. 30 years as a prosecutor had taught me that the real power in any room comes from observation, patience, and calculated action, and Ellis had spent 3 decades perfecting that skill. Dway, still flushed from his earlier outburst, attempted to regain composure. Ellis, he said, his voice tight but controlled, we were just trying to help. It's about family, about responsibility. I cut him off with a single sharp look. Help? By assaulting me in my own home? My voice was steady, low, the kind that carried authority without shouting. Do you think a display like that convinces me to bend to your wishes? His lips twitched, a smile that tried to mask irritation and shame, but I saw through it instantly. All the rehearsed lines, all the concern about parents' apartments, all the feigned worry, they were tactics, nothing more. Lula sat quietly, her hands folded on her plate. The warmth, the daughterly concern I had expected from her was absent. She mirrored Dway's posture, leaned slightly toward him, as if she were his second shadow. Dad, she said finally, her voice flat, almost rehearsed, maybe we should reconsider. You don't want conflict, we just want what's best for everyone. Presumption, best for everyone? I echoed, feeling the taste of bile rise at her words. She had chosen. Months ago, maybe longer, my daughter, the one I had raised alone, the one I had poured every ounce of love and guidance into, had sided with a man who had just attacked me. I pushed my chair back and rose, letting the hardwood creak beneath my feet. I suppose, I said slowly, this is what you consider family. A good son-in-law physically assaulting his father-in-law, and a daughter siding with him without a thought for truth or justice. Randall's hand brushed lightly against Beverly's shoulder, a silent plea for calm. Dway's jaw clenched, and I could almost hear the gears turning behind his eyes. They hadn't anticipated the lawman's reflex. They hadn't anticipated the man who had spent decades dissecting human behavior, predicting every lie, every manipulation. I walked toward the kitchen, and the air seemed heavier with every step. My knuckles brushed against the granite counter, and I flexed my hands to feel the firmness, the solidity, a small reminder of the tangible world amid emotional betrayal. I pulled out my phone. Lawyer. Text sent. The plan set into motion. 5 minutes, and the authorities arrived last night. That intervention had been preventative, a safeguard I'd set months ago, foreseeing this exact confrontation. Jeff. Returning to the dining room, I noticed subtle shifts. Beverly's eyes flicked toward Dwayne, almost accusingly. Randall's hands tightened over the armrest of his chair. The tension was palpable. Everyone was recalculating, assessing the new dynamics. Abortions. Weeby broke the silence, voice lower now, almost apologetic but still laced with arrogance. Ellis, listen. We don't want this to escalate. We're just asking you to think rationally. Family looks out for each other. I smiled faintly. Rationality, I said, pacing slowly, letting the weight of each word settle, doesn't involve intimidation or physical assault. I understand responsibility, Dwayne, better than anyone in this room, and I also understand manipulation, and that's exactly what this is. Lula's eyes flickered downward, shame or hesitation, I couldn't tell. She still said nothing, letting Dwayne speak for her. But in that silence, I recognized a crack, a sliver of truth that I could exploit later. The discussion shifted to logistics. Dwayne spoke about apartment markets, bedroom space, elder care, timing, temporary arrangements. Every phrase was loaded. Every sentence a subtle accusation disguised as concern. My parents, both alive, both perfectly capable, were suddenly struggling, needing space, requiring family support. Each word carefully chosen to manipulate my emotions, to create guilt, to provoke compliance. I remained seated, calm on the surface, while my mind mapped every angle. Evidence of intent, manipulation, and physical assault was all present. Witnesses were here. Documentation would be flawless. If this escalated into legal proceedings, the case would be airtight. Then, his temper flared again. Ellis, it's simple. You don't need 4 bedrooms. My parents need room. We're just asking you to be reasonable. Family doesn't hoard when others struggle. We have a moral obligation. Demolition? I interjected. Moral obligation doesn't justify assault, intimidation, or emotional manipulation. It doesn't justify turning your spouse against her own father. Beverly dabbed at her eyes, her performance flawless. Randall sighed, a low, controlled exhale. Dwayne's fingers drummed against the table impatiently. Lula shifted slightly, mirroring Dwayne's frustration, reinforcing his position. My family had turned against me, or so it seemed. I smiled inwardly. Every detail, every movement, every calculated performance from them only confirmed what I had suspected. This ambush had been planned, rehearsed for weeks, maybe months. They had no idea that I had anticipated this. I allowed the room to simmer in silence, letting their frustration mount, letting them stew in their misplaced confidence. It was a psychological pressure cooker, and I controlled the valve. Then came the subtle escalation. Dwayne leaned forward, voice low but intense. Ellis, think about it. My parents are aging. They need a safe, comfortable environment. You have the means. It's your duty to provide. Just this once, temporarily, think about the bigger picture. I met his gaze, unblinking. Duty? I repeated. No, duty doesn't exist in a vacuum. Duty requires fairness, reason, and integrity. And you, Dwayne, have none of those qualities tonight. He recoiled slightly, surprised by the calm precision of my retort. His mask cracked, and beneath it, I glimpsed fear. Not fear of the law, no. He underestimated that entirely. But fear of exposure. The careful veneer of civility, the rehearsed empathy, the manipulation. It was all on display, fragile as porcelain. The remainder of the evening became a chessboard. Words replaced knives. Glances replaced attacks. Each comment, each gesture, each carefully cultivated sigh became a marker for strategy. I cataloged every lie, every overstep, every manipulation. By the end of dinner, I had not only survived the ambush, but I had also turned it into evidence, a map of intent, betrayal, and aggression. When the family finally left, the room emptied of pretense. I stood amidst the wreckage of dinner plates and shattered illusions. The turkey had cooled, but my resolve had only strengthened. Justice, patient and calculated, was beginning its course. They always assume a man like me will crack the moment the evidence is stacked against him. 30 years in the courtroom taught me two things. People panic when their game is exposed, and the law bends very politely toward whoever brings the cleanest proof. When the cops left that night, they took a statement, took photographs of the bruise already blooming above my temple, logged the broken plate, and promised to follow up. Their presence had been prophylactic, calming the scene, preventing immediate escalation. It had done more than that. It had given me a footprint to work with. I woke the next morning to the house feeling oddly vacant in a way that had nothing to do with the missing plates. Memory sat heavy in the rooms. Photographs on the mantel caught my eye and fought back the ache in my chest. I brewed coffee and moved through the morning like someone inspecting a crime scene. My hands made motions out of habit. Fold, stack, file. Because habits are how we keep ourselves together when the world tilts. First thing, I called my lawyer. The man had been my colleague once, then an adversary in 2 cases, and finally the friend you keep because the world makes more sense when someone else knows the rules. He'd told me over dinner years ago that paperwork and prudence win more arguments than shouting ever will. I repeated that mantra back to him now. Get everything ready, I told him. Phone records, visitor logs, anything that shows intent, planning, or prior communication. I want transcripts from security, if you can get them. I want your advice on restraining orders and emergency measures tomorrow. He didn't ask for details. He knew what "get everything" meant in the language of people who had built careers on procedure. I'll coordinate with the detective on your case, he said. And Ellis, don't engage them. Let me handle the legal front. You rest, gather, and let the paperwork do the talking. Rest. The word felt foreign. Rest would have been a nap in my chair and a book with the corners folded. Instead, I set about gathering evidence with the meticulous patience of a man who knew where to look. The first place I went was where the truth reveals itself most plainly: surveillance footage. 2 summers ago, after a break-in down the street, I'd installed cameras at the front and back doors. They'd been a small concession to paranoia that now rewarded me with clarity. I sat at the kitchen island for an hour, pulling up footage, rewinding, watching the arrival, the forced smiles, the way Dway's hand landed briefly at the small of Lula's back, possessive, dominant, how he'd scoped the dining room like a man reading property lines. The minute he slammed his hand into the plate, the angle caught the motion perfectly. The throw, the impact, the expression that followed. Not an accident. A calculated evil move to force my hand. I exported the clip, stamped it with time codes, and encrypted a copy for my lawyer. With the footage, the bruised temple was not just a bruise anymore. It was a documented crime committed where I had every right to be. Next, I requested phone records. I'd kept mine tidy, calls logged, voicemails filed. But what I needed were theirs. My lawyer made the call, invoking subpoenas the way a conductor waves a baton. Through networks of favors and procedural leverage he'd amassed over decades, he got a look at text threads and call histories that would have been otherwise private. Patterns emerged. Messages between Dway and his parents with language that betrayed rehearsed lines. Tonight, dinner, must persuade. We must move quickly. He's suspicious, act natural. They were crude and unmistakable. The text didn't just reveal intent, they revealed coordination. The house became less of a home and more of a courtroom. I cataloged everything, making a binder. Photographs, the security clip, the police report, the messages, witness accounts. My neighbor, Mrs. Patel, had been prying earlier than most and in the best way. She'd noticed Dway's car idling too long, the way he'd lingered near the side gate, as if checking an unseen timer. She was willing to swear to what she'd seen. People who live next door long enough learn patterns, and deer-in-the-headlights declarations tend to show up in the best testimonies. There was another subtle, corrosive trail to follow: money. A house is not simply a place to sleep. It is an asset people misunderstand the way they misunderstand the weather. something that will always be there, never thinking to protect it. I called my bank and asked for a recent statement. There was nothing untoward in my accounts, but I also asked quietly about unusual activity, loans, title inquiries, any legal steps taken to stake a claim. The bank couldn't reveal everything without a subpoena, but they did tell me what sort of paperwork would be required to take a major step against my property. Foreclosure, transfer of title. Those things aren't casual. They require signatures and legal filings. That meant any real attempt to seize my house would need more than aggressive speeches at dinner. It would require planning, lawyers, forged documents, or collusion. Either way, there would be paper to counter paper. Strengthened, I called my daughter. It was one of those calls I had rehearsed 1,000 different ways in the privacy of my own head, and never once got right. The phone ring sounded louder than it should have. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful. "Dad." "Lula," I said. I kept it plain. No anger at the moment, no attempt at pleading. I knew the theater she had been assigned to. I had watched the rehearsed moments of sympathy and calculated glances. "Are you all right? I just wanted to check." A pause. "I'm fine," she said. "We were just trying to help," I finished for her. There was no accusation in my voice. That would come later, when truth had a stage. For now, I was running a calm diagnostic. "Dad, it's complicated," she said. There was a small crack then, a micro shift that sounded like regret and habit and preparation all folded together. "We were talking about making sure everyone is taken care of. You didn't have to break a plate over my head to do that." The silence screamed across the line. Something shifted on her side. Breath, a soft curse, maybe a hand running through hair. "I didn't," she began, and whatever defense she might have raised dissolved in the way she spoke. It was a small admission, not a confession, but it was more than I expected. "Dwayne said, he said you were being unreasonable. He thought this was the only way." "That's what he thinks," I said, and for the first time in the conversation, I allowed the cold undercurrent of my voice to surface. "I'm not asking for sympathy, Lula. I'm asking for truth. Did you, and I mean this plainly, did you plan this?" Penetrated. "I didn't plan anything," she whispered. "It just happened." Happened? I felt the old prosecutor's gloves come on like a ritual. Door-to-door planning doesn't just happen. It's manufactured. Someone coordinated it. Someone decided to corner their father. Someone decided that pulling at your conscience would be the lever. Thompson, about the line, caught and swallowed. "I'm sorry, Dad. She coughed and fought it down. "I don't know if I can argue with him sometimes. He gets convincing. I thought he had reasons. I thought it would be temporary. I never wanted you hurt." The words were small and they rattled against the walls of all I'd done for her. But she hadn't lied outright. Her fear of Dwayne was real. The way she had mirrored him at the table had been more than strategy. It was survival. People in toxic partnerships develop reflexes for safety. They placate. They conform. They become the echo of the more dominant voice. "Listen to me," I said. "Don't make choices out of fear. You might not be ready to tell the police what you saw tonight, but you can tell me more, and in time we'll get there. For now, stay where you are. Don't go to their house. Don't do anything rash." Shelters. She promised she wouldn't. I wanted to press, wanted to demand a full accounting, to make her speak every detail into my recorder like a witness sworn under oath, but I held back. Sometimes the patient path gives you a fuller view. That afternoon, the detective called. He was pragmatic and not a little impressed in the way men of the law respect someone else who knows their craft. "You did good getting us what you did," he said. "Footage, texts, those are concrete. I need to run a few things, speak to a few more people. There's talk of coercion here, and frankly, family-involved coercion is ugly, but it's not rare." Trembling. "Do you think they were planning legal moves?" I asked. "Not necessarily legal," he said. "More like social pressure and maybe financial maneuvering. If someone wanted to push you out quietly, They'd use the court of family opinion to isolate you. Your daughter's support would be the key. I've been thinking about that, I said. There's another angle. If they're coordinating texts and rehearsing their lines, someone's making a plan. If they try to file anything, power of attorney, guardianship, whatever, there will be documents. I want you to flag anything that looks like sudden legal action. Notify me before any filings I should know about. I'll get counsel ready. We coordinated. He canvassed the neighbors. He interviewed Mrs. Patel and two others who had been at odds with Dway briefly in the past. An argument over a barking dog, a property line dispute that had soured because Dway liked to test boundaries. People like that are easy to provoke. They're also sloppy in their vendettas. Sloppiness is a friend of the patient investigator. By evening, the binder had weight. I leafed through the pages like a man paging through a diary of betrayal. The security footage sat in a sleeve. The texts lay beneath it. The police report was crisp and official. Photos of the bruise were there, time-stamped. Notes from the neighbor. My daughter's wavering voicemail. An artifact I had saved for the court of conscience, if not for immediate proceedings. Though not well. Sleep for me is always strategic. Short, efficient, heavy in the middle hours when the rest of the world sleeps and you have room to think without interference. I dreamed of the plate shattering in slow motion, of kitchen tile turning to courtroom tile, of voices transmuting from family to witnesses. Morning came with the chill of autumn threading the air. I had a plan of my own now. Not one of vengeance born of blind rage, but of quiet, methodical justice. I would use the law as I had used it for 30 years, by throwing light onto wrongdoing and letting the system do what it was designed to do. Protect the vulnerable and punish the violent. Silenced. I requested a protective order, not because I feared immediate harm, though Dway was volatile, but because the order would create paper, and paper creates boundaries. The legal machinery is often slow but mercilessly thorough when fed a steady diet of evidence. A temporary restraining order would prevent him from approaching the house or contacting me while the investigation continued. It would also force his hand. If he wanted to contest it, he'd have to enter a courtroom, where I expected him to falter. My lawyer filed the petition with the county clerk that afternoon. The judge, after a brief review of the police report and the supporting materials, granted an emergency hearing. That was quick, faster than I anticipated, and it told me something. The evidence had been persuasive on its face. Dway would soon have to justify his behavior under oath. When I told Lula, she cried. I didn't press her. I only told her to be safe, to think, and to remember we could still talk. She needed time to find herself again, not to be pulled back into the orbit of fear. People like her don't change overnight. They unravel and then slowly knit themselves back together. The next few weeks became a series of small victories wrapped in mundane procedures. Subpoenas were served. A hearing date was set. The detective found a neighbor who'd recorded part of our dinner, the thud of the plate, the exact language Dway had used. Another neighbor admitted to overhearing a rehearsal in a car outside my house 2 days earlier. The binder grew thicker, each loose sheet a pinprick in the bubble they had hoped to live inside. Hezbollah. And then there was the one thing I hadn't expected. A file, discovered by accident, hidden among Dway's papers while my lawyer followed a civil lead. It was a legal draft, a rough attempt at an affidavit, not yet filed, alleging that I was increasingly forgetful and unable to manage my affairs. It referenced a non-existent incident, warped memories of missed appointments, a fabricated claim of unpaid bills. The forger had tried to create a paper trail that could support a claim of incompetence. If filed, and if believed, it could act as the first step toward guardianship or power of attorney. It was crude. It was clumsy. But it revealed intent in a way words at the dinner table never could. Migration. They had been planning more than a family intervention. They had been planning to take my house by eroding my agency first. The plate had been a crude theatrical push. The affidavit was the real lever. I sat with the file on my lap, the legal draft like a confession in ink. I felt cold anger and a slow smoldering resolve. Some people look for revenge in thunderbolts. I prefer to draw the map of their undoing in pen strokes and subpoenas. It's quieter, cleaner, and far more satisfying. We presented the draft to the detective. He took it carefully, like someone picking up a snake, respectful but wary. The existence of a forged affidavit moved the investigation from assault to attempted fraud and coercion. The lawmen who worked my case began to see the outline of a conspiracy, not a single bad night. Statements were taken. Dewey's parents, faced with the possibility of perjury charges if they testified falsely, pivoted, their earlier rehearsals unraveling into fearful silence. I watched them shrink in front of me. Dewey less than the others, still blustering, still trying to shape the narrative. But once paper turns and evidence speaks, volume is no substitute for clarity. Their performances faltered, their lines frayed. The small courtroom where the temporary restraining order hearing took place smelled of cleaning fluid and cheap coffee. A bailiff called the case. The judge, a woman with eyes like an old switchblade, efficient and immediate, reviewed the documents. Dewey's lawyer, a young man with expensive cufflinks, tried to paint the evening as a family misunderstanding, a man feeling his age and family concern. But when I showed the footage and the text messages and the draft affidavit, the veneer peeled away like old wallpaper. The judge ruled in my favor. The order restricted Dewey from contacting me or coming within 100 yards of my house. It also required him to surrender any purported legal drafts or documents he claimed were relevant. The legal victory was modest in the scheme of things, temporary, procedural. But it did something more important. It forced them out of the shadows and into daylight. After the hearing, standing under the courthouse's stone portico, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph nor peace, but a kind of solemn satisfaction. The law, when wielded with patience and precision, can be a scalpel. It can remove tumors that fester, quietly, behind closed doors. I was only halfway there. There would be depositions, more hearings, and a civil war of documents to follow. But the tide had turned. They had shown their hand and, in doing so, given me the means to expose them properly. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. Lula. She left a message, short, halting, honest in a way that cut deeper than any courtroom plea. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. "I don't know what I was thinking. I was scared. I want to come over." I pulled into the driveway and sat for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The house looked the same from the street, the same bricks, the same light in the study. Inside, plates lay boxed, and turkey bones had long been compost. Outside, the maples had begun to shed their leaves, sending gold and brown flurries down the walkway like confetti for a funeral. Missing. SHTML. I let the message play twice. Then I called her back. Hamstring. "Come over whenever you're ready," I said when she answered. "No demands, just come." Disillusion. She hesitated. Do you hate me?" Missions. "No," I said slowly. "I'm angry. I'm hurt. I'm disappointed. But hate is a heavy thing to carry. We'll unpack it, slowly." She promised to come. I hung up and stood by the doorway, looking at the house that had been both refuge and battleground. Justice had started to move, not as a spectacle, but as a measured sequence of checks and counters. There would be more dust-ups, more legal wrangling, and maybe even betrayal I hadn't yet foreseen. But for the first time since that plate fractured my skull and my illusions, I felt the comforting hum of order reasserting itself, inertia. Even so, there were shadows left. People who had helped them might still be lurking. A forged signature could have been placed somewhere else. Dewey's arrogance could lead him to make mistakes, threats, rash moves that complicate things. I had to be ready. I had to keep my binder at hand and my wits about me. Justice, I'd always said in court, is patient but not blind. It sees slights, patterns, and motives if you give it evidence to work with. I had given it more than that. I had given it documentation, witness testimony, and a motive that made dark sense. Greed dressed up as concern. The law would do the rest if I kept feeding it fact. We were moving into the deep part of the case now. Depositions, interrogations, the slow, sometimes brutal unspooling of intent. It wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be clean. But it would be real. Breathing settled again in the house filled with long shadows. I felt a small, private peace. Not because the fight was over, far from it, but because a plan, laid out patiently and executed precisely, was beginning to work. The next moves would be theirs, and with any luck those moves would be clumsy and obvious. Mistakes are where guilt reveals itself, and I had an eye for guilt. Tomorrow, I told myself, we would go through the files again. We would tighten loose threads. We would make sure the paper trail was watertight. But for now, I poured a small glass of whiskey and sat at the kitchen table among the folders and the flyers and the photographs, the city beyond my windows settling into night. There's a particular satisfaction in laying out evidence like a quilt, stitching together moments and documents into a pattern the world can understand. I spread the binder open and let the quiet of the house press around me. The justice I sought was not the kind that raises a banner. It was the kind that reorders things, piece by patient piece. They had come for my home. They had thought one violent move and a few rehearsed lines would be enough. They had miscalculated. They had forgotten one lesson that had carried me through a career of cases and into this personal war. People who build their lives on other people's weakness always leave a trail, and I had learned to follow trails until they led me where I needed to go. They tell you in law school that truth has a way of revealing itself under oath. They don't tell you that the truth sometimes arrives like a slow leak, almost imperceptible at first, then suddenly a gush that leaves the whole house sodden. After the temporary restraining order and the hearing, the pace of things changed. The loud theatrics of the dinner had given way to a quieter, nastier work. Depositions, subpoenas, notices, and the kind of legal minutia that eats at people until they confess to things they swore they'd never admit. The courtroom's fluorescent light always made my eyes water. I'd been in rooms like these for most of my life, rooms where people try to turn memory into merchandise, where the softest cough becomes a signal, where a lawyer's pen is more dangerous than a knife. Now I sat on the plaintiff's side, my binder on my knee like armor. Across from me, Dway's lawyer, a man with a face comfortable in television commercials, tapped his pen and smiled the kind of smile that suggests he's already written the ending. We started with depositions. First, a procedural one, me. The court reporter's stenotype clicked like a metronome as I spoke. My answers were deliberate. I told the story plainly, the facts uncluttered by anger. 20 years of cross-examination trained me to let the facts do the work. I left emotion to the margins and let timelines, timestamps, and texts fill the center. People in my profession learn to trust the record more than they trust their memory. Dway's deposition was uglier. He sweated under questioning, his face blotchy as he tried to parry simple questions about messages he'd sent to his parents, his timeline that night, and who had suggested what language to use during dinner. His answers were slippery, long pauses, qualifiers, words like "I guess" and "I think." He tried to blame alcohol, to minimize his throw as a momentary lapse, but the footage had a frame-by-frame cruelty to it. His hand was beyond reasonable explanation. When his parents, Randall and Beverly, were called, they stuck to the script at first. Practice helps, but so does fear. The detectives' inquiries and the existence of the draft affidavit made them cautious. Under oath, their earlier bravado shrank. Faced with the possibility of perjury charges, the rehearsed empathy turned into hesitant, clipped statements. They admitted to discussing housing needs in vague terms, and when the prosecutor's focused questions touched on the draft affidavit, their eyes flicked to one another, and then away. That small avoidance told me more than their words did. Evidence does not always win hearts. It often wins practicality. The moment I saw their lawyer lean back and say something brief into his phone, I knew they were recalibrating. People will change their stories when consequences feel very real. I'd watched that pivot hundreds of times. cross-examining men who thought the truth was negotiable until it suddenly wasn't. The damning pieces of evidence, one I'd not expected to find, came from an unlikely place: a routine visit to a title company. When you own a house as long as I had, the paperwork accumulates like rings in a tree. I'd asked my lawyer to pull a quiet history of any inquiries or attempts to place liens or claims against my property in the months before dinner. We were avoiding alarm. This was administrative housekeeping. The title company called back with something peculiar: an inquiry, a draft document flagged by one of their clerks. Not official, not filed, but a draft of a power of attorney form with a notary's stamp penciled on in a hand that matched a cheap script someone might forge. The form carried dates that were suspicious, and a preparer's name I'd never heard. It was enough to bring in a professional handwriting analyst. Watching the analyst work was a humbling lesson in how small human behavior can be. There was a cadence to a hand that betrays intent: pressures, slants, strokes that belong to the same person, or to a forger who thinks he can beat the world with ink. The analyst's report, dry and meticulous, concluded that the signature on the draft did not match my hand. The paper trail had a fake in it. Someone had tried to build a legal staircase to take my house and had gotten sloppy by not covering the first step. I learned that Dway had spoken to a local notary about emergency filings 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I felt the bile rise, sharp and acidic. He'd been shopping for a solution, someone willing to mark paperwork without asking too many questions. It was the kind of move the reckless make when they believe law is just a flexible set of rules for other people. The discovery phase thickened. Bank records, previously resistant, came through under subpoena and showed small transfers. Wire movements of amounts that, on their own, might have meant nothing. But the pattern was telling. Money moved from a joint account Dway had access to, small amounts funneled into a new credit card in his name, payments for services like document preparation, a courier with a P.O. box. Greed is not always a roar. Sometimes it's a whisper that grows louder as people get used to the sound. Relila called often in those days, each conversation a new layer of complexity. She was a study in contradictions. Her voice flattered between guilt and fear, sometimes defensive, sometimes open. I learned to ask the questions that pressed on the soft parts without tearing them. "Did he coerce you?" I asked once, and she deflected, talking about pressure instead. "Did he ask you to sign anything?" She hesitated for a painfully long beat, and then admitted she had signed a couple of family documents. Utility authorizations, a standard statement authorizing access for a contractor. Things that, alone, were ordinary. But she could not remember signing anything that removed my autonomy. Her answers were a map toward the next step. If she had signed innocuous things, perhaps documents had been substituted. Or maybe Dway had relied on forged signatures to build his case. Either way, I had to be careful with my line of questioning. Push too hard, and she might withdraw entirely. Be too soft, and she could grow distant again, swept back into the orbit of a man who knew how to put on a face. Mediation angle tried to nibble at the edges. I'm not a man who seeks attention. Intimacy and quiet are my preferred atmospheres. But in the kind of fights that involve family and money, someone always smells a story. A local paper called with a cautious request. Would I comment on family disputes and elder care? I declined. Publicity would only enrage them or push Lula further away. This is one of the brutal trade-offs. Sometimes privacy is the best weapon. Exhaustion as the weeks turned. A slow erosion occurred in the small social circles that had backed Dway. Neighbors who'd been casual in their support began to distance themselves when subpoenas and depositions came knocking. They didn't want to be dragged into a public spectacle. Sometimes the fear of being involved is the most effective deterrent. Mrs. Patel, who had lived next door for 27 years, told the detective she'd heard rehearsals from Dway's car, the same phrase over and over. Make it about care, not money. Words meant to be used like talismans to ward off suspicion. But the more they tried to sanctify greed, the more obvious the motives became. Their first mediation was scheduled in early December. My lawyer told me mediation often reveals what a party is willing to admit when the cost of continuing outweighs the cost of conceding. I went because I expected them to come with a performative apology, a plea to repair family ties, and a thin plan for temporary moves that would slowly become permanent. I expected arrogance wrapped in contrition, stimulated. What I didn't expect was how quickly their faces would drain when the mediator, a woman with a voice like ice steel, laid out the exhibits, security footage, texts, draft affidavit, the notary inquiry, and a ledger of questionable transfers. She asked Dway a simple question: "Who advised you to draft this affidavit?" His reply was a fumbling litany of half-truths. "I consulted online resources," he said, "and a legal aid website." The mediator didn't blink. "Do you have receipts, names, documentation of any legal advice you received?" He had none. Under the mediator's steady gaze, he tried to reframe the affair. Poor communication, stress, a misunderstanding. But the documents told a different story. Truth, once laid out in ink and pixels, acts like gravity. It pulls things toward it. It was in mediation that I watched a key fracture happen. Beverly, who had been brave in private until the subpoenas came, began to tremble when confronted with the draft affidavit and the handwriting analysis. Facing the prospect of being named in an official complaint for conspiracy and forgery, her courage abandoned her. She offered a halting statement, a confession that it had seemed like a small thing at first, that they had been scared for their future, and that Dway had pushed the idea forward. Her words were small and useless as apologies when weighed against legal culpability, but they mattered in a different arena: family. Restraining, Lula's eyes widened when she heard Beverly's admission. It was like watching the last hold of a spell break. She turned to Dway, fury and sorrow, and a hurt so raw it could have cut glass. The man who had been the storm in their household suddenly looked very small, his certainty replaced by a quivering anxiety that suggested he'd misread his control. "Why would you do that?" Lula whispered, voice a break between disbelief and accusation. "Why forge something against Dad?" Dway's response was a tangle of justification. "We needed a plan," he claimed. Everyone was panicking. He avoided the word forge but did not deny the essential action: preparing documents that would shift power into their hands. Under the fluster, he blamed fear, the market, his parents' needs. It was the same language, different clothes. Fear dresses itself in logic when it cannot stand on morality. Prejudice called a recess. Outside the mediation room, there was a silence as heavy as a coffin lid. I walked a few paces and found myself beside Lula in the corridor. She looked at me like someone seeing an old painting in a new light. "I'm so sorry," she said, then something more honest. "I was scared. He would tell me things about how you're failing and how we need stability. I thought I was protecting everyone." "You were protecting him," I said gently, "not your father. But we'll fix it. Slowly. We'll fix it together if you want." Her nod was shaky, but there was resolve there. Something in my chest eased. Maybe this would be the turning point, the moment when fear gave way to accountability. Or maybe it would only be the first step in a longer, more painful road to truth. Back at home that night, with the house quiet and my binder open, I considered the mediation's small victories. The documents had forced the family into a corner where they had to reckon with the reality of their actions. It wasn't justice in the cinematic sense, no dramatic courtroom confession or public shaming, but it was perhaps more effective: an internal collapse. Then came a small, brilliant stroke of luck, because in long disputes like this, luck is a currency as valuable as evidence. Dway, in his haste and arrogance, had left something unguarded: a cloud-synced folder on a shared account. It's a banal thing, modern people will tell you. Who doesn't have one? But in that folder were drafts, versions of the forged affidavit, emails with a notary he'd contacted, even a scanned image of a signature sample. It was almost funny how banal the means of his undoing were. He hadn't thought to remove the digital breadcrumbs. Greed often makes people careless. Shimmer. We subpoenaed the account records and within days had a cache of files that filled in the gaps. The drafts showed iterative attempts to make the affidavit more plausible. Changes in dates, added phrases about memory lapses, references to missed appointments that never happened. A scanned image of a signature was labeled in his own handwriting. Sample. Use this. That single file read like a confession when placed between the pages of legal exhibits. Blackmail. Confronted with the digital evidence, Dewey finally crumbled. He admitted to drafting the document and to contacting a notary who would help us file something quickly. But his admission was partial and self-serving. He insisted I had been negligent, that the house was a burden, that he had meant to protect his parents. The words were tinny, like the clink of coins, valuable for some uses but unable to cover the cost of what he'd done. Him. We took the evidence to the prosecutor, who had begun to assemble a case beyond civil claims. Criminal charges for attempted forgery and conspiracy began to crystallize. The fabric of what they had attempted to build, part legal strategy, part moral gaslighting, was coming apart stitch by stitch. The prosecutor, a woman who moved with the quiet precision of a samurai, asked us to give her a little more time. She wanted to present the strongest possible case. She wanted not just to punish rashness, but to create a deterrent. Him. As the investigation moved forward, family dinners became a thing of the past. Invitations were awkwardly withdrawn. Mutual friends chose sides, or chose silence. It's a peculiar thing, to watch a social circle constrict like a fist. People are practical. They don't want to be associated with scandal. For Lula, this was perhaps the hardest part. Watching relationships that had been easy become strained or severed. In the slow hours of those nights, I thought often about the small pieces that had made all the difference. A security camera installed after a neighbor's burglary. A neighbor who liked to trim hedges at odd hours and thus heard rehearsals. A title clerk who raised a flag. A young, slightly arrogant man who trusted the cloud to hide his sins. Justice is often less about righteous thunder and more about small, almost trivial acts of foresight. You collect them and then lay them out like bricks. About what I owed my daughter. There is a peculiar grief in watching someone you raise choose a dangerous path. Love complicates even a case as straightforward as this one. What I owed Lula was patience and a removed sternness. She'd been both a victim and an accomplice. She had made mistakes, but she wasn't irredeemable. When the prosecutor finally indicted Dewey for attempted forgery and conspiracy, I felt no elation. That's a strange thing to admit. There was only a solemn acknowledgement that the law had done what it could to make right a wrong. Punishment is not the balm for the ache of betrayal, but it is an engine of repair. A record that the world, through its laws, recognizes harm. Prepared for trial, the coming months would be a carousel of hearings, motions, and the kind of legal chess that requires mental stamina. My life, for all its quiet habits, had become a public file in a way I'd never sought. But with every subpoena returned and every document authenticated, the picture of intent grew sharper. They had tried to redraw a life map with forged lines and false claims. They had failed. At night, I would sometimes walk through the empty rooms, touching the banister my late wife had polished for years. The house still held ghosts of laughter and good days, and I protected those memories jealously. When things got rough, I thought of the small, honest acts that built a life. Paying a mortgage on time, hanging a curtain properly, learning to make the turkey just right. The law might restore what it could, the title, the control, the formal rights. But memories are creatures of time and love. Those were mine no one could forge. Chapter closed on a small domestic scene that felt almost sacred. Lula knocked on my kitchen door one dusk and walked in carrying a small box of my wife's china, plates I hadn't seen since they were packed after the dinner. Her hands trembled as she set them on the counter, then looked up with eyes unaccustomed to honesty. "I want to help," she said. "I want to make things right, however long it takes." I took her hands in mine, feeling the soft callous of a woman who'd learned to flinch at the sound of raised voices. "Then start by telling the truth," I said. And stay. Be present. That's where repair begins. She nodded, eyes wet, and for the first time in months, the house felt less like a battlefield and more like a place that could be mended. The legal battle would rage on. The calendar would fill with dates. There would be more hearings, more revelations, more adjustments to the plan. But in that small, steady moment with my daughter at my side, I felt the quiet of unraveling turn, just a little, toward the slow work of rebuilding. The trial did not feel like theater. It felt like work, slow, deliberate, the kind of grinding labor that turns raw injury into public record. Witnesses were called. Evidence unfolded like a map. The prosecutor, cool, exact, unbothered by spectacle, laid out the timeline with the same calm that had guided me through 3 decades of cases. The security footage played in court. The draft affidavits, the cloud folder, the text threads, the neighbor statements. One by one, the pieces clicked into place. Dway's bravado folded under oath. He squirmed when asked to explain the drafts in his own handwriting. His answers were small and hot. They betrayed a man who had believed himself cleverer than he was. Randall and Beverly tried to plead ignorance at first, but under cross-examination, the edges of their story frayed. The mediator's transcript, the handwriting analyst's report, the bank transfers. These were not arguments you could drown with denunciations of misunderstanding. They were documents. Documents do not care about intentions. They only record what was done. Lula sat through the trial with her hands knotting and unknotting in her lap. She had been a complicated witness, sometimes candid, sometimes evasive, because truth, in her case, had to be learned anew. I didn't expect absolution. I only expected honesty. When she finally took the stand, her voice was thin but steady. She described pressure, the slow narrowing of options, the small lies that had become larger through repetition. Her testimony wasn't a dramatic confession so much as a peeling away of layers, a quiet reckoning with how fear can turn into action. Deliberated for less time than I feared. The verdict was not a thunderclap, but a legal inevitability. Guilty on counts of attempted forgery and conspiracy. Sentencing was measured, jail time for Dway, probation and restitution for Randall and Beverly. The judge's words were not about revenge. She spoke of responsibility and the ways families can weaponize love. It was not the same as losing my hair in the wind on some imagined mountaintop, but it was real and concrete. Consequences that matched intent and harm. After the verdict, the house felt oddly still. The practicalities of repair, fixing warped trust, mending routines, moving through the embarrassment and gossip of neighbors, were ahead of us. We took smaller steps. Lula began to come over more. We cooked together, badly, and laughed about ruined casseroles. She helped me catalog old photographs, placing little sticky notes with dates and names where memory had grown thin. Those were small, sacramental acts, folding the past back into order, piece by piece. There was a settlement to handle the civil claims, a quiet reckoning over money and title that felt less like justice than tidy housekeeping. The title to my house remained mine. Paper pushed back against paper, and the law, when given time, did its tidy bureaucratic work. The legal victory could not erase nights where I'd felt alone in my own home, but it bought something else, space. Space to grieve the betrayal, space to rebuild the relationship with my daughter, space to reclaim the ordinary cadences of life. People asked if I felt triumphant. I didn't. Triumph feels like a trophy. This felt like repair. It felt like setting the household clocks back to time where truth guides the hands. Some days were hard. Seeing an empty spot at a dinner table where trust should sit, answering questions from curious neighbors, hearing Dway's name in the paper. But most days were ordinary in the most healing way. Lawn mowed, mail collected, a cup of coffee at dawn while sunlight cut the study in half. Lula and I talked about therapy. She went at first privately, and then the two of us sat in a small, sunlit room with a counselor who had a patient smile and knew how to let silences teach. We spoke of fear and the ways people defer their judgment. We spoke of codependency and the slow corrosion caused by one person's appetite for control. Those conversations were not dramatic reversals. They were small re-education, the steady work of someone learning to trust the bearings of her own compass. There was also something I had not expected. Apology from Beverly and Randall that was not filtered through lawyers. It came in a thin, awkward way. Handwritten notes, a small bouquet left on the porch, an invitation withdrawn with humility. Their remorse was clumsy but present. It did not erase what they had done, nor did I expect it to. It was, however, a necessary part of the ledger. Acknowledgement. Sometimes accountability arrives in the form of admitting a mistake, even if it cannot repair all consequences. I would sit in the study and turn pages in the binder that had kept me company through the trial. Evidence, for all its coldness, had led to something that mattered beyond vindication. A clearer view of who I trusted and why. It taught me that love, however enduring, must be coupled with boundaries. It taught me to listen more to the small alarms. It taught me that holding someone accountable is not the opposite of loving them. Often, it is love's last polite stand. Months later, the holidays came again. We did not celebrate in the theatrical way we had before. There were no speeches about sacrifice or pleas disguised as charity. We ate turkey, imperfect and blistered at the edges, and we talked about small things, garden plans, a neighbor's new dog, Lula's awkward attempt at a new recipe. The chandelier cast the same warm light. The china my wife had loved was placed gently on the table, each plate a small reunion with memory. When Lula reached across the table and squeezed my hand, there was no need for grand declarations. Her fingers were warm and familiar. In that simple touch, there was an unspoken promise. We would try again. That was enough. Throttle had not been a cleansing fire. It had been a slow, necessary tending. It left scars, on trust, on the walls, on the quiet parts of the week, and it left us, finally, with something steadier. The knowledge that truth can prevail if you are patient enough to build the case for it. In the end, the house stayed mine. Not because I clung to it out of stubbornness, but because it was where I had built a life grounded in small, honest things. The rest, the rebuilding, the cautious forgiveness, the return to ordinary days, would unfold one unremarkable, precious moment at a time.